Economic decision-making in the times of global crisis becomes all the more urgent when viewed in the backdrop of the scale of jaw-dropping financial losses that have hit cryptocurrency asset space following this week's FTX collapse, or when one thinks about 33 million people by the catastrophic floods in Pakistan, inflicting more than 30 billion US dollars loss and damage, and about a war in the heat of Europe that is entering in its 9th month, that continues to weaken the global economy, continues through the significant disruptions in trade, food, and fuel price shocks. In the midst of all this, one is also hopeful that the funding pledges under the COP27 will be honored, that the Biden-Xi G20 meeting will indeed boost US-China engagement, but more than that, will force these world powers to focus on global economic revival rather than rivalry. We in Pakistan keep hearing the word economic security in every report, policy, speech. Perhaps we all need to first think about economic equity, economic equality, about building from the bottom up rather than burning down. Without further ado, let me first thank you, our keynote speaker, Dr. Aisha Rauz Pasha, for gracing our forum. She will be speaking on the economic decision-making in the times of global crisis. Madam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum to all. I see a lot of international audience here, and my list of panelists is a very impressive one. First of all, let me start by thanking the Margara Dialogue for inviting me over. I am going to focus on Pakistan, given the panel will be concentrating more on the international implications. Starting first by where we are. Now, I'm going to be candid in my talk to you today, and because until and unless we are candid and we realize and recognize where we are, redressal becomes very difficult, and moving forward doesn't come easy. So how have we done over the last, if I see over the last, since the beginning of the millennium or even over the last 10 years, our growth rate in terms of our average has actually come down. We did have an average growth rate of 2.8% during the period of 2008 to 13, which increased to 4.8%, reaching 6.1% in 2018. And since then, we are averaging at 3.4%. So our growth is down. Our revenues actually over the time have, one of the reasons is that our revenues have been increasing so much, so our investment levels over the time have not gone up. If there are no revenues and there is no investment and no savings, then the investment levels are compromised. And we see that our investments have not been increasing, both by the public sector. In fact, the public sector investments have come down over time, and it's just 3% of the GDP at this point. When you look at the private sector investment, again, the story is not very positive. This is an area that we need to work on, and until and unless we have that, we will continue to be a country where the per capita income continues to be low. At this point of time, we stand with $1,798. That's our per capita income. Our trade deficit, because of our international our trade balances, has also been growing. At this point of time, we're somewhere close to $39.7 billion in the last year that ended in June 2022. So basically, the story here is that we need to given the fact that we are a country of 230 million people or so, the kind of a macroeconomic imbalances that we are facing is of concern to us. When this government took over some 7 months ago, we were in the midst of severe macroeconomic imbalances, close to a crisis situation, to put it mildly. The growth that we had been experienced earlier was all consumption-led, because of which we ran into a very acute external side problem. And on the external fiscal side, we had a budget deficit which was, very high, and consequently, the country went in more deeper into the debt trap, which was not a good position to be in. And the consequence of all of this is inflationary pressures, high inflationary pressures. To top it, this existing situation, we had the floods. Floods which have the economic costs of the flood, if I can quote to you some, major statistics about it, will give you the impact of it and the severity of the problem very quickly. The damage need assessment and the economic losses because of the flood, which have been estimated in collaboration with the international agencies like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and European Union has also helped us, the Planning Commission, to arrive at those numbers. We are, at this point of time, our estimate is that the flood has cost us something like $30 billion. The economic consequences are very high. The standing crops have gone, the housing stock has damaged, livelihoods of a lot of people have been impaired, and livestock has perished, which is a very important component of our rural economy. So to recover, we are estimating that the country will have to put in an additional $15 billion or so for reconstruction. And if the country has to revive very quickly, then we have to almost immediately put in measures so that the losses are minimized, and so on and so forth. And this situation, we are in this situation, despite the fact that we are a very marginal contributor to global emissions. 0.6% is our contribution, while we stand to be among the 10 most impacted countries of the world affected by climate change. So the point that I'm trying to make to you here is that this problem that we have seen in 2022 as a major challenge, I call it not only a major economic challenge, I call it a human catastrophe. This situation is here for us to stay. And it's not going away if we close our eyes to it. We witnessed floods in 2010, then in 11, then in 14, and now the 22 floods have indicated to us that they are increasing. And it's a problem that we need to do something about, not only with mitigating our own contribution to it, which, as I've already indicated, is not very high, it's very marginal, but very importantly, adapting to it. It is here, and we need to adapt. Our reconstruction has to be climate sensitive. It has to be, so that the climate resilience of our reconstruction effort has to be put in mind, which has its own implication. Now, given this domestic scenario, the global economic challenges are also very strong. And if I can name four of them, the first one is the Russian-Ukraine war conflict. We all know the implications of it, what it has done to global markets. It has led to a commodity super cycle, which Pakistan has directly been affected by. Part of our current account deficit issues are because of the high global prices. Floods have affected us. We are importing more because of the food security element and other, the standing cotton crop going down, washed away by the floods. So that has its implication. Then, as it is, the global economy was just, recovering from the COVID shock. lingerly recovering from the COVID shock that the pandemic had actually caused across the globe. And the fourth one, I would say, is also the Fed's increasing the interest rates. The Fed increasing the interest rate because of inflation there has had its impact, ripple impact on currencies internationally. And given our own situation, it has had an impact on our own depreciation, with which we have had to deal with, not only in terms of higher debt servicing payments, but also in terms of higher import bills, and with the consequent impact on the current account deficits. Now, given this scenario, what is it that the country has to do? Now, with the international global challenges, I don't see the country recovering very quickly. See, the global economy, from what we see, is still in 2023 in a state of recession, in 22 and in 23, with high inflation, primarily a cause of the Russian war. And I've already given to you the example of what the high interest rate costs of the US have done to. Implications for Pakistan are both on the current account side and on the export growth side. If the global economy is in a phase of recession, then our export growth becomes an even bigger concern. So we have to look at that, and our imports are on a higher prices. We have to look at that. So we need to keep in mind our trade deficit. It becomes a huge challenge, not only for us, but also for some of the other countries which are in similar areas. So, and also at the side of all of this is that the cost of borrowing becomes very high, which has its own implications. What the global response to all of this would be, we can see, particularly from the climate point of view, because that's one of the things that is, focus at this stage internationally, particularly because of the United Nations response to floods and the climate change events that have taken place around the globe. Even the multilateral agencies are focusing on it. So, so we do see some additional financing coming and some announcement of some coming to Pakistan. But my point of view is that our expectations should be realistic. We have to get our own house in order. We have to mobilize our own resources. There are long-term structural adjustment needs that the country has to fulfill. First of all, our commitment to stay on the IMF program has to continue. It continues despite the flood trauma that we've gone through. We stand committed to our structural adjustment program and the IMF program. And all the rumors that we were hearing in the middle, in the primarily courtesy of some of the media, houses, we have no intention of going back to the Paris Club. We stand committed, we want to pursue. We want to undertake some structural adjustment programs. We cannot live beyond our means as a country. Our priorities are 2-3. We want to first stabilize, bring down inflation, bring down the macroeconomic deficits. Our fiscal deficit, we have to bring down by higher resource mobilization through base broadening. We have already instituted measures to curtail our expenditures to bring the deficit down so that our borrowing needs are minimized to the extent they can be in these difficult circumstances. Exports is our priority because we need to earn more. Despite the global environment, which is not at this stage is not very bright for us because of as I said, the situation. Nonetheless, we have to tap new markets, we have to sell new products, along with pushing our exports in the traditional sectors. I am a very big pusher of exports, not only in our traditional 5 sectors, the textiles and so on and so forth, but I think our hope is also the emerging and nascent exports that we have. Take IT, for example. The kind of a growth that we've shown, demonstrated over the last 3 years, $1.5 billion or so. These are areas that we need to just push forward. New markets are the areas we need to push forward, along with developing our original areas and markets. So that's an area of our big importance, and we need to, along with these structural measures of controlling, human capital needs to be our continued responsibility. There cannot be growth and security in a country if there is no economic security and human security. We need to continue on with it, and our focus in that will have to be on education, health, and climate resilient infrastructure development. Again, something that we need to focus on, along with our continued focus on structural adjustments that we have undertaken, and we continue to do so. I want to talk in particular also about some of the areas of importance in my mind relating to poverty and youth. See, we're a country in youth bulge, and it is not a good situation to be in when you have something like over 1 million youngsters idle, who are not in educational institutions, who are not seeking employment and are not employed, but they're just there. So while we are concentrating on bigger issues like macroeconomic stability and getting the balance of payment right and getting the budget deficit right and getting the climate resilient financing right, we have to continue to not forget these areas which should be of our concern. Getting them employed, bringing the poverty line lower. These floods, whether you, I don't know whether you've seen the numbers or not, the initial estimates are that something like 9 to 11 million people have fallen below poverty because of the floods. These are people who should continue to remain our priority. And let me tell you, some of the efforts that the government has done are to focus on them. We know that agriculture has to be the backbone of this because it's an employment-intensive sector. It's a sector which turns around very quickly. We need to revive the economy after the losses that we have incurred because of the floods. We have brought in the packages. We are keeping these in mind. The agricultural package itself will, the financial outlay would be 600 billion rupees or so, spread over some time. That needs to be in some ways the initial driver of revival of the economy, along with the SME sector, which again I feel is somewhat neglected, but now needs to be focused on more intensely than ever before. And I think with the time allocated to me, I've defined to you the broad parameters on which the government is working. Short-term economic stability, structural adjustment with human face, our commitment to our international support agencies like the IMF and development agencies stands totally committed. And we realize that in these times of global economic crisis, while we are looking towards the global community to help us out because we've been victims of things that we are not responsible for, particularly when it comes to climate change. It's a matter of justice that the global community and the big emitters compensate the developing countries for the damage that they are causing. Along with that, we have to bring our own house in order. And that should be our continued priority, not only for the short run, but also in the medium-term perspective, with the structural reforms getting priority. With that initial statement, thank you so much for hearing me out.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your insightful speech. And I must say that climate change is one of the top priorities, and it's more of a development, it's more of a governance issue at the moment. And apart from looking at the short run, we need to look at the long run strategies how to make Pakistan sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, we formally open our panel, and our first speaker for the panel is Professor Vilas. Dr. Vilas is a professor of Urban Innovation and Sustainability Program at Department of Development and Sustainability, School of Environment, Resources and Development at Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand. His area of expertise includes systems approach and management for urban sustainability, urban competitiveness and resilience, climate change, and circular economy. Dr. Vilas will be talking about sustainability with a focus on urbanization. Doctor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anil. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really glad joining this important dialogue. In fact, I thought I'm not supposed to give a long talk, but I am glad to be here and maybe expand what perhaps I plan to say. First of all, according to the banner, just to clarify, I'm from Asian Institute of Technology, or in short we call AIT. In the banner saying like I'm dean of the institute. In fact, I'm the dean of the school. The institute includes a total of 3 schools. By the way, AIT also has a number of alumni and students from Pakistan. I think one of the top 5 number of students and alumni in our institute. Many of them also holding quite a good position, both public and private sector. So I'm Dean of the School of Environment, Resources and Development, like Dr. Andrew has mentioned. So within this topic and discussion, as mentioned, I'm perhaps like to focus on the infrastructure, and something can be linked to the accessibility, in particular in the urban context and incorporating the climate change. As we all know, the world at the moment, we already passed more than half of the population living in the urban area. We can call that we are now in the urbanizing world. And in this case, not only past few years or in the next few years, we predict that in the next, at least in 20 years from now, we will have many more people in the urban area. So this is quite dynamic, perhaps not much in terms of the cross-boundary or trans-boundary aspect, but the urbanization is one of the key drivers of any kind of development or the change, and it's part of the UN SDG, at least SDG 11 very much emphasize on many goals, indicators and targets regarding the urbanization. When we talk about sustainability and linked to the urbanization, we may call like urban sustainability, which I very much giving lecture and then doing some research. We can go back to the very basic thing that we like to do from the sustainable development or the sustainability. Basically, we all know that we need to try achieve both all the economic, social, and environment. I think these are kind of the very basic bottom line. But the challenge is not one by one. The challenge is how we really balance, and balance perhaps not enough, how we really synergize among at least economic, social, and environment. Many of these are not very much synergized. We may call like even partly the trade-off or become the constraints while we developing even basic or some infrastructure in the urban area. We try to promote any kind of connectivity, the economic growth, or partly the accessibility to the different users. But there could be the consequence, in other words, more on the negative side of any kind of infrastructure we are developing. That's just a quick example that how we really balance, and at the same time, if we can synergize any kind of development that we are moving into. And it's partly quite dynamic, as mentioned. So it's not really kind of one formula or one indicator. We have to look forward from what I may call like multiple dimensions. As the moderator has mentioned, one of my special interest is about the system approach. So that's the way I might like to offer some idea and then some implication regarding this system approach. Now, within this movement, the sustainability still, to me, could be one of the most important, and that's what I just mentioned. But there are some other aspects can be subset of the sustainability. When we talk about, like, in terms of climate change, for example. Yeah, this kind of climate change is not within the city or boundary of the even sub-region. It's coming, like Madam keynote speaker has mentioned, it's coming from partly outside some kind of global effect. And when we talk about climate change as an example, also dealing with the multiple dimensions as I just mentioned. By the way, I'm not a climate scientist, but I can offer some of the idea how to incorporate the climate change into the, for example, like urban and infrastructure development. In terms of the climate change, as Madam has also mentioned, on one side, we need to be concerned on the greenhouse gas emission, which is quite well known, and the COP27, we're just about to conclude, continue with more and more talks tied to deal with whatever 2 degree or 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Still ambitious, but we need to move on with some certain target. And different countries would contribute. We develop and developing countries. So that's on one side, and at the moment, getting clearer. In order to achieve whatever degrees Celsius by the end of this century, we need to move into a low and lower carbon greenhouse gas emission. And now, not only lower, become like net zero carbon, or sometimes we call the carbon neutrality and so on. So I think this is quite clear. And obviously, it's not one country, it's not one sector of infrastructure or one city. So this kind of collective effort, we need to divide among different key players, including different countries. Now, on the other side of the climate change, Madam also has mentioned, it's about adaptation. Now, adaptation is something that even without climate change, we face some risks, like flooding as a clear example. By the way, I come from Thailand. We also faced, I think the same year, 2011, we call the Great Flood, and affecting, in terms of the area, maybe about half of the countries, but economy-wise could be like 70% or more, which is very comparable to the case of Pakistan within the same year. Without the climate change, we faced that. Like the case where I mentioned in Thailand, people believe that maybe less than even 10%, just roughly, caused by climate change. And maybe similar in Pakistan, because quite complicated how water flow and then how we have different area of the flood, some area flood or not flood, and so on. So this is not very new, but with the climate change, we face higher risks. That's provide maybe both the opportunity and the challenge. The opportunity would be, we have been facing this anyway, since even last more than 50 years and so that we make use of our own experience, our historical effort, including like urban planning, urban development, to deal with the risk reduction, or in other words, we call adaptation. But with the climate change, with maybe the long-term kind of the effect or the risk, we have to see more in terms of either from the investment or from different measures to implement what we call the adaptation. So these two sides of the climate change is very much well known, and just back to our institute at AIT, we have much strong offering from, we may call like we are like keen in terms of the capacity building. And as mentioned, we have quite a big number of the graduate students, including alumni. So in the sense of the research, we may go one by one. But I like to offer back to the system approach. Many countries and many cities and key players now also moving to this direction. How we synergize, at least between mitigation and adaptation. And in terms of the basic infrastructure development, for example, like the transport or water, hydropower, and so on, there are quite a good potential to synergize. Sometimes we call it co-benefit incorporating both mitigation and adaptation, as I mentioned, in certain infrastructure development. This is a good chance because we try also to do more research, but in terms of the cost effectiveness, this will be something that we really like to see better. And at the same time, while we look at this co-benefit, hopefully we can achieve more, not one by one. Not only basic infrastructure in the urban context, taking maybe not Islamabad, which is not very big city. I had some former students taking research in Lahore, larger side of the city. I hope would be more potential to look into this kind of the co-benefit. That's what I call. Now the co-benefit, when I start talking about the climate change, would not be limited to that. Simply, we have to manage any kind of the infrastructure for our quality of life, for the basic accessibility, for basic household or commercial or even industrial types of the users. So in that case, the co-benefit can be expanded. It's not limited to the climate change. Now, when we expand to this, back to the sustainability, we may look at certain, what we simply call the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. From the climate change, which is about the SDG 13. This could be quite related to, like I mentioned, SDG 11, which is about the resilience, about the sustainable community or the city. And also another example also dealing with like energy in terms of SDG 7 as an example. So in this case, I like to offer that we look forward to see how we generate or capture, maybe a simple way to call, more and more the co-benefits from the climate change, non-climate, and focusing at least from the infrastructure and urban development point of view. So that's maybe the first part that I like to cover at this point. Then the second point that I like to maybe get into a bit more detail is about how we really implement any of this idea. Mainly, we face multiple dimensions I start mentioning. So in that case, the climate change, like when we talk about greenhouse gas emission, when we talk about just only 3 years, people will just say, oh, what to do with that one? But it's a long-term effect. So this is a kind of challenge that, at least between mitigation and adaptation, we are talking about here. Most of the adaptation are short-term because we are facing flood maybe regularly, almost every year, every 5 years. But from the greenhouse gas emission, low carbon, and so on, we have to deal with the longer term. So this is the challenge. If we want to put this in the 5-year development plan as an example, I believe Pakistan also having this kind of the, what we call the a bit master plan at the national level. So how we incorporate this kind of at least 2 aspects into the national planning. But still a chance to incorporate. I would offer that from the time scale, any kind of a bit medium term would provide higher potential. Because as mentioned, the short term become too limited. The longer term might be better in the developed countries because this kind of long-term plan could be more applicable. But in most, at least developing countries, I would offer that any of the medium-term 5-year, 10-year plan would have quite a good potential to deal with this challenge. Now, the second part of the multiple dimension, which I may like to get into, is about the scale. From the urbanization point of view, taking any particular city or country as example, we start from a bit smaller scale, we call like communities, towns, and now become city or even metropolitans. So this is a challenge that when we plan, and partly the challenge is about the dynamic aspect. So we have to look at the multiple scale of this, what we call the expanding or kind of the co-benefit. So that from the research point of view, we are doing this kind of thing because when we want to promote, for example, what we call the green infrastructure. The green infrastructure provide quite good potential to deal with different aspects here. But the green infrastructure would require this, what we call the multiple benefit, and at the same time would be good to go into the multiple scale. There could be other types of the multiple dimension, which if I had more time, I could elaborate more. But I would be pleased if any further discussion or interaction to move into this direction. And I'm much happy to offer any kind of the consequence in terms of the more discussion, and at the same time, I look forward to have kind of joint effort with the colleagues in Pakistan, and obviously to have more students, creating more alumni from Pakistan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vilas. Our next speaker is coming from China. She'll be joining us online, Dr. Tao Withao. And Dr. Tao is a professor of economics at Shenzhen University, and she's the former vice chairman of the University Council and currently serves as the director of China Center for Special Economic Zones. And she'll be talking about economic globalization and the human society. Can we have her online? Okay. Dr. Tao, can you please share your address?
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's my honor to deliver a speech at the forum. Today, we will share the topic.
窗口变得越来越窄，国际竞争表现得越来越激烈。同时呢，发展权、生存权、排放权等问题的矛盾，也成为阻碍经济全球化的一个重要因素。如果经济全球化导致贫富差距加大，不仅不利于经济全球化的健康发展，也会侵蚀经济全球化的正义性。当经济全球化成为国际政治博弈的工具时，经济全球化的正义性就被损害了。丘吉尔有一句话：“伟大的代价是责任。”伟大的事情总是简单的，最伟大的事情只有一个词：自由、正义、荣誉、责任、仁慈、希望。祝论坛圆满成功。
I believe my Chinese is very sheshe. Thank you very much, Dr. Thao. And just to summarize, like what she'll be talking about, that economic globalization is the progression towards the direction of human security and society. And the crux of her talk was that the powerful countries are taking advantage of their hegemonic position and exploiting the economic globalization. And then she talked about some of the strategies, how we can go for the proper long-run economic globalization. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker for the session is from England, and that is Dr. Salman Ahmed, and he's the Global Head of Macro and Strategic Asset Allocation at Fidelity Investments. And he'll be talking about how geopolitics changing the geoeconomics and investing, what has been the role of climate change in capital flows, and what are the lessons that we can learn from countries which has high economic growth rates. Dr. Salman.
Pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you and the audience in Islamabad. It was great to hear Professor Tao talk about the globalization forces which have been in place and how they are shaping through now as we move into a world where geopolitics has become very important. So from a investor and investment flows perspective, geopolitics for the last 15 to 20 years has been more of a secondary factor in terms of when assessing global capital flows and understanding and mapping the best opportunities for return generation. But given the events of the last few years, which have obviously escalated and become much more front and center, we have to also develop a number of frameworks to understand how it affects long-term investing. So, of course, the US-China angle and what's happening there is going to be very important for the next 5 to 10 years. We are mapping the different implications of that relationship going forward, especially in the context of war in Europe. I guess it's clear to say that this anchor is here to stay, in the sense that this decoupling which is going on may ebb and flow, but the underlying structural drivers of it are clearly here, and you can see that in the political discourse in the US, and then of course the developments in China. So that's something from investment flow perspective is going to be very important, and again regional differentiation and regional centric views are once again back on the table, whilst before it was more about which sectors and which technologies and which areas of investment, irrespective of geographies to a certain extent, could be beneficiary of capital flows. But now the regional angles are much more important. It brings me to the second point I want to mention is is how to think about economic models for countries which are not economic superpowers, and are thinking about their economic models in a very different. And of course, Pakistan is a case in point here from that perspective. I think tapping economic shifts here are going to be important. Professor Tao talked about recalibration of supply chains. I think it's going to happen two ways, i.e. both from west to east and east to west. And there's also, of course, focus on capital chain security, not only trade chain security. So the concept of reshoring, friendshoring is taking hold. Important developments for corporates and companies we speak to, we invest into. Fidelity International has a very big equity business, so we are speaking, engaging with our investee companies globally, and those topics and dimensions are quite important now. And that's something as Pakistan has to think about, because the reality is that Pakistan did not participate in the last big globalization trend, and it's visible in Pakistan's economic growth numbers. It's visible in the per capita income developments vis-a-vis the different parts, different countries in the region, which to different extent did participate in that globalization, which came through, especially since China's entry into world, WTO in early 2000. There are various factors behind that, but the reality is that Pakistan did not participate at all, and that regime itself is changing. So as we're thinking about calibrating economic models for Pakistan, firstly we need a new economic model. I think some of the diagnoses which are, I think Madam Minister was talking about are correct, but diagnosis itself is not a solution, and there will be important factors to be thinking about in terms of the structural change in the regimes which are happening and how Pakistan can participate in that. That brings me to the third point I want to share with you is climate change, because it's obviously is very important for Pakistan and the region as a whole. Of course, devastating floods which affected Pakistan, and I listened to the number Madam Minister was mentioning, around $30 billion worth of loss for a country like Pakistan. That's huge, almost 10% of GDP. So we have been doing a lot of work at Fidelity and obviously in the industry as well, as climate change has become front and center of our clients and investors' minds as we deploy capital. And our long-term assessments are pretty bleak on Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh specifically. So if there's a lot of modeling which has been done now, and you can use that to do various scenario projections. The one we use is called the Berg-Siang model, which is called damage function approach, which is that you take in the climate temperature pathways and then project it on economic GDP profiles of different countries. What climate science does tell us is that it's a geographical phenomenon, i.e. not every country is as vulnerable to climate change as it may appear from general public discourse. And under those models, what is called RCP 8.5 scenario, which is basically if emissions do not come down and temperature pathways from here move towards 3C or 4C increase above pre-industrial levels, then according to those damage functions, Pakistan's GDP will be almost wiped out by 2100. So around 95% damage to GDP versus baselines. And that's driven by collapse in arable land, collapse in water tables, and the fact that the country will not be able to grow any food if those kind of pathways do come into place. That's not to say that those scenarios are inevitable. Of course, human activity in the form of greenhouse gases, as Professor Willows was talking about earlier, are important developments, but Pakistan is at the forefront of that damage. And there is a clear-cut existential risk to the region, and Pakistan, India specifically as well. According to the same models, China is quite vulnerable as well. Around 30 to 40% of GDP of China is vulnerable to climate change, and those are big numbers. And even though we've gone through the modeling in more details, and we do think that it potentially is a conservative estimate of how climate change can wreak havoc with food systems and water table availability and productivity growth. Then lastly, how does that affect investing? I mean, we are in the process of incorporating these scenarios into our long-term investing frameworks. At this stage, the industry and where we are is on engagement, which is to highlight these science and evidence-driven factors to countries who we think are very vulnerable. But at some point, as focus on these scenarios strengthens, evidence continues to gather that climate change is indeed affecting these countries, including obviously those who are the most vulnerable ones, in a very significant and permanent way, then permanent capital flow can start to divert away from these countries. But at this stage, it's more engagement, raising the profiles, thinking about mitigation, adaptation, and of course, capital flows to facilitate that. But here, governance is important, political stability is important, and of course, realization that this is an issue which requires not just diagnosis but a solution, and a structured solution is important for private sector to participate. The private sector's demand to participate in climate change solutions is huge and significant. Of course, with public sector focus here with COP26 and now COP27, there is a lot of data, not a lot of frameworks which are being developed, and we do see the private sector capital wants to engage and deploy on solutions which can avoid some of these catastrophic endpoints, even though if they are in the very long term. But having said that, the climate events we have seen over the last couple of years, in fact, are more dangerous than the projections which we are using right now, which in itself tells us that some of those countries will fail to exist if nothing is done on bringing climate change back onto the tracks. So all in all, for long-term investment flows, climate change is becoming quite central. It's the vulnerability of countries and differential vulnerability of countries is more significantly acknowledged, but at the same time, those solutions and structural solutions need credibility through stability and understanding of those problems and how to deploy capital to help solve those challenges. And then that goes back to the, I think, the geopolitical environment. Of course, the US, China are critical players, even if you look at climate change, some communication, cooperation would be needed, and we are hoping that will come through, despite some of the challenges which have come through since the onset of war in Europe. But lastly, I'll just go back and say, share that, Pakistan, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from countries who benefited from that globalization wave over the last 10, 15 years. But that globalization wave, as Professor Tao mentioned, has run its course. And the next 15, 20 years are likely to be very different from what we have experienced previously. And there is this concept of, as I mentioned earlier, reshoring, friendshoring, supply chain reconfiguration, capital chain reconfigurations, which we needed to be assessed carefully, and that economic security will certainly be the need of the hour, but that is actually needed for any kind of security now, and how that translates into economic prosperity remains to be seen. So that's where we stand. Overall, our outlook for the next 1 year is what we call a polycrisis, which is multiple crises hitting us from different directions. Madam Minister covered quite a few of those already in her remarks, but our views are still on the cautious side. We do think that a recession is inevitable in the US in the next 6 to 9 months. Europe is already in a recession because of energy issues. And countries who are exposed to commodities will remain vulnerable to those shocks. And that in itself highlights the importance of building structural strength and resilience so that these cyclical shocks can be absorbed. And we have seen a clear-cut differentiation in countries within the commodity importer vertical, whereby some countries have navigated this shock way better than their own history, and versus their other peers, and then that's because of the structural resilience they have built up, either via very high reserve levels, diversification of energy supplies, but that hasn't happened in the short term. This has been in place for years, and it has come through and given them that benefit once this shock has come through the pipeline. So there's a lot of differentiation there as well, and as investors we are focused on that, but it's still because of this big reconfiguration which is happening as a result of the war in Europe, and of course Russia-Ukraine at the center of it, with Europe being at the center of these reconfigurations. It has more to run, and the world economic and industrial setup will look quite different than we have been seeing currently. So that's a little bit on the cyclical side of things. And overall, our views are, as I said, on the defensive side, cautious side on economic developments, global economic developments, and although on China we are a bit more positive than the general market, we do think reopening will come through. That will help the economic activity to pull back from the damage which came through as a result of zero COVID policy. But overall, downside the risk to growth when we look at US, recession in UK, recession in Europe, and some countries like India, Brazil, to a certain extent, doing better than both the developed market world and some other countries in emerging markets. So I'll end my comments and remarks here and hand over the floor back to our host. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. And I must say that as you focus on trade, the trends have changed. Like the 4 things, like now we talk about just in time, just in case, supply chain security, and internationalization of SMEs, which has changed the trade scenario at the moment. And yes, we need to focus on the climate compatible development. Our next speaker is from the World Bank, Hans Timmer. He's the Chief Economist, South Asia region, the World Bank, and he will be sharing his views about the decision making in the uncertain times. Hans.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I would have loved to be with you in person. Last week I was in the region, but unfortunately this week I had to return to Washington. I will take the perspective of the South Asia region because that is what I'm working on. And let me start with an obvious observation. These are not normal times, and that means that standard policies or ad hoc reactions to shocks are not good enough. This is a time where you should think about bold actions from a longer-term perspective. These are not normal times. The South Asia region, in short order, was hit by a series of what I would call once-in-a-lifetime shocks. In short order, once-in-a-lifetime shocks, or what a moderator calls the black swan events, shocks that we used to think have only a very low probability, but probably we have to rethink those probabilities. So you have the war in Ukraine, which upended the commodity markets worldwide, posing a major challenge for commodity importers. We thought that Europe would not see a war again. We had the devastating floods in Pakistan, mentioned already several times during this session, even worse than the previous floods. We have a full-blown economic and balance of payment crisis in Sri Lanka. For the first time ever, that a country in South Asia defaulted on its sovereign debt. Defaults are quite common in the rest of the world, but this was a first for South Asia, and that all comes on top of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was the worst pandemic in 100 years. And so we know that after every major crisis, after every major global crisis, the world will never be the same again. We have seen that after the 1930s, we have seen that after the oil crises in the 70s and the 80s. We have seen it after the global financial crisis, but we should expect to see it now again. A crisis comes with geopolitical shifts. Often new technologies emerge during a crisis. Important, but in my view, it is not enough. I think we should learn deeper lessons from the kind of shocks that I just described. And one important lesson is that the international community was not ready to cope with these kind of shocks. The governments were not ready to cope with these kind of shocks, and also the people within countries, and especially the poorer people, were not ready to cope with these kind of shocks. So let me briefly say a bit more about that lack of readiness. So first, the international community. It is great that Pakistan played a leadership role in the COP27, and that more pledges are now on the table to support countries like Pakistan who are seeing the impact of climate change. It is important that more funds are being raised to support developing countries in mitigating emissions and transforming their energy. But just funds, however important they are not good enough. We need also a system in which not only funds for global public goods are being raised, but a system where these global public goods can be used efficiently. And a lot of work needs to be done there. On the government side, you see that the governments were not ready. They did not have the buffers, fiscal buffers, foreign exchange buffers needed to respond to shocks, or quickly they used up those buffers. But more importantly, they also made several mistakes, kind of panic reaction to the shocks that came to the region. You saw the use of import bans, of export bans, of price controls, all very logical from short-term political motives, but it quickly backfired and worsened the economic situation. You saw temptation to use fiscal stimulus when a country is faced by a negative supply shock. Also a logical first response, but actually it leads to more inflation and it doesn't lead to more growth. So there is the danger of stagflation if you only use demand-side policies to react to supply-side shocks. Great job has been done in the region in terms of supporting firms, bridging the COVID period and the lockdowns, but it is very important to exit these strategies also. And then perhaps the biggest hit was taken by the poor people within South Asia. The people in the informal sector that could not socially distance, the people, the migrant people that suddenly had to return home, and then the poorest households that spend a much larger share of their budget on food and energy than richer households. And those poor households also were not prepared to absorb these shocks. The standard and important reaction to that is that we need to expand the social protection system. That was done in several countries in South Asia, including in Pakistan, but that is also not good enough. The ultimate long-term answer to make people more resistant is to integrate them more into the economy, to give them more access to markets and finance. In Pakistan and other countries in the region, 80 to 90% of the people are stuck in the informal sector with very low productivity. Only 20% of the women are participating in the labor market, and that has to be addressed. So, to conclude, this is a time for bold action with a long-term perspective, no panic reaction, no populist measures, but a real rethinking of vested interests, unleashing the potential in the informal sector of women, and a system of international finance that creates not only the finance but also the opportunity to use the global public goods efficiently. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hans. And ladies and gentlemen, moving on to our second last speaker, that is Sultan Khalifa Al-Rabai, and he's head of economic studies section at Trends Research and Advisory. We'll be playing his 5 minutes video message, and then we will move on to our next speaker.
Dear colleagues, experts, and officials participating in the forum, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for my colleagues in the Islamabad Policy Research Institute for inviting me to participate in this forum, which is attended by this elite group of experts. I would like to thank them for choosing this important topic. As we all know, the whole world is experiencing the impact of a series of successive crises that spread rapidly, imposing new challenges to the political and economic decision makers who have to deal with them efficiently, whether to mitigate the risks resulting from them or to maximize the opportunities that they may create. The current economic crises are completely different from any previous crisis. In the past, governments could overcome such crises and contain their repercussions by adopting common financial and monetary mechanisms and instruments. However, today's crises are so interconnected that even the most powerful economy cannot manage to overcome them alone. Starting from the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 and the Ukrainian war, high inflation rates, shortages of food and energy, disruption of supply chains, deaths in developing countries, and the increased natural disasters resulting from global warming. The global economy is now experiencing one of the worst stages it has gone through in modern times. This creates more complications for the economy's decision makers to deal with those overlapping and interconnected crises. Ladies and gentlemen, dear attendees, the main challenge in the economic decision-making process is not limited to the multiple variables that must be taken into account, but also their persistent overlap and impact on each other. Given the severe global economic conditions, as previously mentioned, economic decision makers have to consider the following four major factors. First, decision makers shall build on accurate and updated data, otherwise their decisions will not contribute to overcoming the economic crisis and may even create more of them. Second, decision makers shall adopt an accurate methodology to calculate the feasibility of economic decisions and comparing the potential outcomes based on an accurate feasibility assessment, a number of flexible and alternative decisions to cope with the speed of change in global economic problems and crises given its overlapping and interconnected nature. Third, decision makers should realize that the cost of any economic decision is closely related to its timing. In other words, a proper decision taken at an improper time may lead to more mistakes that would perpetuate crises instead of addressing them. The fourth and most important factor is that the quality and suitability of the economic decision-making process are the basic guarantees for achieving the desired outcomes. The succession and coincidence of global crisis has exaggeratedly increased the uncertainty of the decision-making process, which has in turn created harder and more complicated obstacles to the economic decision-making process. For example, a decision that targets curbing domestic inflation would severely affect the stability of the national currency, while a decision that targets increasing exports would require doubling the efforts to support and upgrade local productivity. Despite the fact that the interconnectedness of variables is an inherent characteristic of this domain, the current crises have doubled these interconnections, especially between the national and international variables. I believe that the global future is threatened by two risk factors with significant impact on economic decision making. The first has to do with the rapid depletion of economic resources, while the other relates to the severe negative impact on the environment, especially the impact of global climate warming. Given the current economic crisis and future threats of violent environmental crisis, economic decision-making mechanisms shall be developed and scientific methodologies for foreseeing the future to predict crisis and identify their possible scenarios and the best alternatives and options for dealing with them. In this context, we realize the vital role that research and study centers can play in foreseeing the future and supporting the economic decision makers with insights, ideas, alternatives, and solutions, not to mention the importance of strengthening economic cooperation between countries and governments with the accelerated pace of globalization, the growing economic interdependence among countries, and the development of means of communication. No country will be able to avoid the consequences of economic crisis that occur in other countries. Moreover, no country can manage to tackle economic and environmental crisis single-handedly, no matter how strong it is. This requires activating the role of international economic organizations and economic dispute resolution mechanisms, as dialogue and cooperation shall replace confrontation and unfair competition. I will stop at this point, and peace be.
Thank you very much for to Trends Research Advisory. And as I was listening to Sultan Khalifa Al Rabai, I was thinking about Daniel Kahneman, that decisions are not good or bad. It's what matters is the process. If you're following the right process, the probabilities that decisions are going to be good. We have our last speaker, that is Dr. Dai Yong Hong, and he's the Dean of College of International Studies at Shenzhen University. Dr. Dai, you are on.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are now. Ladies and gentlemen, so as the theme of Forum A is on economic decision making in times of global crisis, so I chose to do something different by focusing on the philosophy of decision making based on Chinese Taoism, kind of philosophy in ancient China. So my topic today is inaction or non-interference in international governance. But due to the time constraint, I will not elaborate on the Taoism theory here, but only discuss three issues within the scope of the conference theme. Firstly, I will introduce what is Tao and the basic concept and of Taoism theory. Secondly, Taoism is not only a representative of Chinese wisdom, but also a crystallization of East Asia civilization. Thirdly, from my own point of view, I would like to talk about the wisdom and experience of the Tao theory in today's international governance. So the first point, the basic concept of Taoism, we can understand it from only 3 points. Firstly, who created the word Taoism? Taoism was actually developed by Chinese Lao Dan, who is called Lao Tzu to show respect to Chinese people. As a matter of fact, Lao Tzu is not an old man. His family name is Lier and his written name is Dan, an ancient Chinese thinker, philosopher, writer, and historian, founder and main representative of Taoist school, as well as a cultural celebrity in the world, one of the 100 historical celebrities in the world. Second, what is the representation work of Taoism? Tao Te Ching, one of the most widely published works in the world, is the representative of Taoism. In the 1980s, according to the statistics of UNESCO, Tao Te Ching is among the world's cultural masterpiece, and it is one of the largest circulations translated into foreign languages. And thirdly, how Taoism is defined. Lao Tzu himself defined the Taoism as the integration of things, the heaven and the earth. The Taoism is invisible and illusory from its inception, and everyone can have their own interpretation. Personally, I tend to think that Taoism is a law of harmony. Society is actually harmony between man and nature. It is precisely because of Taoism is a law of harmony between man and nature that Lao Tzu said the highest state is inaction. because only inaction is to follow the law of things and the nature itself, and thus governance without doing anything can be realized. So now the theory of Taoism can be used to, how the theory can be used in current international relations. Firstly, my understanding is that to do nothing. In Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu put forward the political idea of govern without doing anything, which was mainly aimed at rulers at that time. Governing without doing anything doesn't mean that you don't do anything, but not to interfere excessively, to give full play to the positive initiative of the general masses of the people, so that everyone can make the greatest contribution to the society. This is not only applicable to politics, but is also a great wisdom of life. Secondly, from inaction extended to inaction without action. Doing nothing is not doing anything, but doing something, because you still need to do something, because you do not violate the objective law and follow the objective law. You can't do anything. This is the idea. That means that you can do anything as long as you follow the Taoism and follow the objective law. Okay, now let's discuss the core idea of Taoism in today's international community. How to apply it and how to learn. How can we learn from it? Let's start with the analog of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu once said, "Look at my teeth and my tongue. My teeth are very hard, but now they are all gone. The tongue was soft, but now the tongue is still here." Lao Tzu's analog illustrates the truth that softness can overcome the rigidness. Hard teeth cannot last long enough, but a soft tongue can accompany you to death. Compared with the current international society, the world dominated by some hegemonic states, supported by materials and hard powers. But how effective is it? Did they solve the terrorism problem by invading Afghanistan? Did the invasion of Iraq improve or worsen the living standards of Iraqi people? They have fought every war of invasion only to restore its troops at last. This fully proves that the hard approach cannot fundamentally solve the problem. Instead, it should start now and coordination from the spirit and the soft side. Now, finally, now I have another example. Let's talk about the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap is used by many people to view the so-called rising and maintaining states. But as far as Lao Tzu is concerned, there is no need to worry about the maintaining states and the rising power. There is no need to fight. It is because of this not fight that he can secure his position. During the First World War, for example, Germany challenged the UK, and the UK fought against each other with Germany to secure its hegemony. But what was the result? What did the two strugglers in the Thucydides trap? The UK did not struggle to secure the hegemony, but surrendered its hegemony to the US on the other side of the Atlantic. Therefore, we also use the idea of Tao to suggest that the current international governance should not take a one-sided view of Thucydides trap, but view peace in the international community in the light of Taoism. So, what does governance without action represent in international governance? In my view, non-governance means non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, and respect for the right of the people of all countries to choose their own path of development. We firmly reject the idea of hegemonism. In fact, the point also resonates in the West when Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, discussed the market economy. He clarified that the best government is the night watchman. The government should not interfere with the market. Let the market develop fully and only need to maintain basic social order. This reflects the idea of doing nothing. Similarly, the more trouble that some countries want to create, the more unstable the international community will become. So let's ask ourselves, did the US invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, or Syria solve the problems or create new problems, such as refugees and the spread of terrorism? Aren't these new problems created by some countries' success? Therefore, if some country
connectivity issue. But ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude our first panel. And we have room for 3 questions for our esteemed panelists. Kindly state your name and the question. And it need to be a question rather than a comment. Can anyone take the mic over there to the gentleman? Or if you can speak out, I believe this, our esteemed guests can hear you. Can we have the second question from the House? Speech is similar, silence is good. Either you understood everything or no question. Over there, please.
So please, Mike. It was a wonderful session. Thank you very much for that. Ma'am, my question is for you. You hinted in your speech that the consumption-led model adopted by the previous government caused maximum harm to the economy. I would like you to highlight as to what are the production-led models or things that you wish to apply, because as far as I see, even the shopkeepers are not under your control. You exempted them from taxes and other taxes. Tax to GDP ratio is in the doldrum, and we don't see anywhere that's going to improve. So basically, this is the question. We are talking about global things, supply chain. Our contribution to the world GDP is not even 0.5%. So these are the things for big economies like China. I'm not going to go into thousands, but just restrict myself to that question. Thank you.
Our last question over here in the same.
Assalamu alaikum, I'm Dr. Amna. I have just one question to the Madam Minister. You just mentioned about supply chain, and you wanted to improve the list of exports already being done. As Western mentioned, that we are having a very short list of exports, and we are having very less probability to introduce new things. why can't we concentrate on the billion of services as export? Because that the world market is open, especially the labor market in the wake of small population outside, and we are having 2 million youth for in working capacity. We can train them and we can send them. Only the certification and channelizing is required. No more investment is required. So I think that should be the consideration. But it's your answer about that. Thank you.
And we have a last question, Ambassador Raza.
Just a very small question, ma'am. Do you see the light at the end of the tunnel? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Madam, all questions going out for you. You are popular.
Actually, let me systematically take these questions and start with the first one, the gas position. See, given the international environment, we've already mentioned how things are going in terms of the, because of the Ukraine war and the energy situation globally, where things are. So not only in terms of availability, but also the price. So both things are affected, and that is having an impact on us. What we are planning to do under the circumstances, one, go ahead and get as much as we can, given this overall availability, and we are working on it. Second, we need to manage our load better. So when you're short of something, your load management becomes very important. We want to do that without putting any extra burden or unbearable burden either on the domestic side or on the productive side. So we're working a strategy, we will come up with it. We do not want to, we realize that at this point of time in the agricultural cycle, we need to develop fertilizer and put it in the market. We can, so the factories have to work. We also understand that people, the domestic sector cannot be totally ignored. So both things are operative, we're working on it, and inshallah we'll try and make the best of the situation that we have. The second part about donor fatigue. See, there are two important elements here, in fact three. I've already, and the other speakers have already indicated to you the international environment, economic environment. We are talking in terms of global recession, slowing down of the global economy, at least in, in the next short term. We are also talking in terms of higher inflation. We are also talking about the crisis that we have spoken about with climate and everything. But that is not going away anywhere. And it has impacted not only Pakistan, but a number of other countries. So suddenly the demand of driven because of crisis internationally has gone up. We are part of it. So we are operating in that scenario where there is, as it is, shortages. Second, more demand because of more crises around globally. And third, our own factor. So our strategy basically is that we are very grateful to the global community for helping us out with the relief and rescue stage for, following the flood. They've been very kind and they've been very good. The UN Secretary General Flash Appeal was launched and we got a response. Things, not only in terms of cash but in kind. A number of countries came through. We are very grateful. We are now at the stage when we want to go ahead with construction, rehabilitation and reconstruction. We're looking at, and we're looking at the pledges there also. But the important part is that besides looking at that, we also have to generate our own, do whatever we can. Initially we did, we took it out of our own budget. The initial expenditure already incurred is around 160, if you look, 65 billion rupees, if you look at the provincial side also. We are expecting some more in the years, for which we are basically repurposing our own PSDP as well. things have to be diverted because these are high priority projects, so we have to manage that. So we're trying to manage it to the extent that we can. Now, coming to the question about consumption-based, the point of the matter is that it's not only the previous government, the growth, the spurts of booms and busts that we see in Pakistan over a longer period historically is the primary reason that the growth models that we've been using in this country are more consumption-based. We have, periods of cycle where there is a little influx, money coming in. It's like an injection coming into the economy. There is good, growth. Then the growth increases the demand so much. Our exports are not correspondingly increasing. It ends up in a balance of payment crisis. Now, if from 1988 to date, we've been to the IMF 23 times. When do countries go to the IMF? Countries go to the IMF where there is an external side problem. So we have to really, really think about this. What growth, if it's so important for us, which we know we need to grow because we have to generate employment and so on and so forth, how do we want to go? Structural adjustments have to take place. They, by definition, may not be painless. And the nation has to stand up, devise that strategy, and implement it. And my plea on all forums is that let's depoliticize the economic structural program. Let's just all stand together. We all have to contribute to the pain that goes through. And then once we've gone through that stage, we will find ourselves on firmer ground. Now, regarding the question about services export, I can't agree with you more. This has to be an area of our, the focus that we are putting in. Not only traditional exports, exports of services, exports of IT, and I'm also saying tourism. These are the sides we have to now explore increasingly. And we have to put in place strategies to take them forward. I agree with you, and we need to do that. And finally, we are a resilient nation. We have seen many a crisis. We always get out of them. And I see no reason whatsoever that we will not come out of this. What is required? We need to strategize, hold hands, stand up and say, we will do it, and there is no reason Pakistan will not be able to do so. I see light everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, madam. And with this, we conclude our panel. I thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Aisha Ghaus, our panelists, Dr. Vilas, Dr. Salman, Dr. Tao, Sultan Khalifa Al-Rabai, Hans Timmer, and Dr. Dai. Ladies and gentlemen, our developing countries right now need economic positioning, pragmatism, multilateral cooperation, and strategic autonomy. With this, I hand over to Osama. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anil Salman. Now I will actually request Dr. Aisha Ghaus Pasha to kindly present memento to Dr. Vilas Nityavathanan.